The Mafia-Boss's colic baby wouldn't stop crying on the train until a single mother did the unimaginable. The infant's screams tore through the first-class compartment like a knife through silk, relentless and agonizing. Every passenger in the pristine cabin flinched, shifted uncomfortably, or cast furtive glances toward the source of the chaos. But none dared to speak. Not when they saw the man cradling the child. Before we begin, I need your help. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters. If you enjoy forbidden romance and stories of dangerous men who'd burn the world for the ones they love, please hit that subscribe button. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me your city or country. It means the world to know our stories are reaching you wherever you are. Santo Trevisano sat rigid against the leather seat, his jaw locked so tight it could shatter steel. The perfectly tailored navy suit that usually made him look like a lethal work of art now seemed to suffocate him like a noose. His normally ice-cold eyes, the kind that had witnessed executions without blinking, held something unfamiliar. Terror. Pure, helpless terror. The baby, his son, continued to wail, tiny fists beating weakly against Santo's chest. 3 months old and already marked by tragedy. 3 months since Juliana had died, bringing this child into existence. 3 months since Santo Trevisano, the most feared don in the Sicilian underworld, had become something he never imagined possible. Powerless. Boss. One of his men leaned indiscreetly. We could stop at the next station. No. Santo's voice remained dangerously smooth. We continue to roam. But the baby didn't care about Rome. He didn't care that his father controlled territories spanning 3 countries. That politicians trembled at his name. The infant only knew hunger, pain, and the devastating absence of warmth he'd known before it went silent forever. Santo had tried everything. For rows back from the screaming infant, Linda Marshall felt her body betray her. The letdown reflex hit like a physical blow, sharp and undeniable. Her breasts ached with a familiar fullness she'd been trying to suppress for 4 months. For months since she'd held her daughter's perfect, still body. For months since she'd left Chicago with milk meant for a baby who would never drink it. She pressed her hand against her chest, willing her body to stop responding to a stranger's child. Stop caring. Stop feeling. She'd come to Italy to forget, to outrun the ghost of a nursery painted in soft yellow, to escape the sympathetic looks and the terrible, suffocating silence of her empty apartment. But the screaming continued. And something inside her, something primal and maternal that grief hadn't managed to kill, wouldn't let her look away. The man holding the baby looked up, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Linda saw the tattoos crawling up his neck, the expensive suit that couldn't hide what he was, the danger that radiated from him like heat from asphalt. Every instinct screamed at her to stay seated, to mind her own business, to let someone else's tragedy remain someone else's. She stood anyway. Her legs carried her forward on autopilot, past the businessman pretending to read his newspaper, past the elderly woman who'd moved to a different car entirely. Santo's bodyguard stepped into her path immediately, one hand disappearing beneath his jacket. I'm a nurse. Linda's voice came out steadier than she felt. Pediatric nurse. I can help. Santo's eyes narrowed, assessing her with the kind of scrutiny that made lesser people confess to crimes they hadn't committed. No one can help. He won't take a bottle. Won't take formula. It's been 18 hours. I know. Linda swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. I lost my daughter 4 months ago. I'm still. She couldn't finish. Couldn't say the words out loud. Instead, she met his gaze directly, let him see the truth written in her face. Understanding flickered across Santo's features, followed by something that looked almost like hope. Dangerous, desperate hope. You would do this? His accent thickened with emotion. For a stranger's child? I'm a nurse, Linda repeated, though they both knew that wasn't the real answer. The real answer was that her body was screaming to feed this dying infant. That her arms ached to hold something other than emptiness. That maybe, just maybe, saving this baby could make her feel less like a failure for the one she couldn't save. Let me try. Santo stood abruptly, Richard still wailing in his arms. His men moved with him, a synchronized unit of lethal protection. But Santo raised one hand, stopping them. "Give us the lavatory. No one comes close." The train lavatory was cramped and institutional, smelling of chemical soap and recycled air. Santo entered behind her, filling the tiny space with his presence. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the faint tremor in his hands as he held his son. "His name is Richard." Santo's voice was barely audible over the rumble of the tracks beneath them. "Linda." She held out her arms, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, he placed the screaming infant against her chest. Richard's cries had become hoarse, desperate. His little face was blotchy and red, his lips tinged with the faintest hint of blue that made her nurse's training kick into overdrive. Dehydration. Possibly severe. She unbuttoned her blouse with trembling fingers, aware of Santo's eyes on her but no longer caring about modesty or propriety or the fact that she was locked in a train bathroom with a man who had death inked into his skin. All that mattered was the baby. The moment Richard latched on, the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was almost shocking. Santo exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. His hand came up to brace against the wall, knuckles white with pressure, and Linda realized he was shaking. This feared mafia boss, this man who probably gave orders that ended lives, was trembling with relief as his son finally fed. Linda looked down at Richard's face, peaceful now, his tiny fist curling against her chest. Tears she hadn't known were falling dripped onto his soft hair. She'd thought her body producing milk for a baby who would never need it was the cruelest joke the universe could play. She'd been wrong. This, feeding life back into a stranger's dying child while her own daughter remained forever silent, this was the cruelest gift she'd ever been given. The train rumbled on toward Rome, and in that cramped lavatory, 3 broken pieces of 3 different tragedies locked together in a bond that neither Linda nor Santo could possibly understand yet. But in the Sicilian underworld, some debts could never be repaid, and some acts of mercy could never be undone. The train slowed as it approached Roma Termini, and Linda realized she'd been holding Richard for 40 minutes. He slept now, his tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm against her, a complete transformation from the screaming, dehydrated infant he'd been an hour ago. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the weight of Santo's stare from across the narrow lavatory, calculating and intense. "We need to talk." His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that didn't expect refusal. "Before we leave this train." Linda adjusted Richard gently, buttoning her blouse with one hand. "I did what needed to be done. Your son was dying." "I know." Something flickered in Santo's ice-blue eyes. "That's the problem." The platform outside erupted into controlled chaos the moment they stepped off the train. 6 men in dark suits materialized from the crowd, forming a tight perimeter around them. Linda's heart kicked against her ribs. She'd known Santo was dangerous, the tattoos, the bodyguards, the way other passengers had avoided him, but seeing his operation in action made it visceral and terrifying. "This way." Santo's hand settled on her lower back, guiding her toward a black Mercedes with windows too dark to be legal. "Please." The please surprised her, as did the gentleness of his touch. She should have run, should have screamed for help or melted into the crowd. Instead, she found herself sliding into the leather back seat with Richard still in her arms, Santo beside her, and 2 of his men in front. The doors closed with a heavy thunk of reinforced steel. "Where are we going?" Linda's voice sounded calmer than she felt. "Somewhere we can speak privately." Santo pressed a button, and a privacy screen slid up between them and the driver. "You saved my son's life. In my world, that means something. I'm a nurse. It's what I do." "No." Santo turned to face her fully, and Linda saw the exhaustion carved into his features, the shadow of grief that mirrored her own. "What you did goes beyond medicine. You gave him part of yourself. Your body, He searched for the word. "Your essence. Do you understand what that means to my people? Your people." Linda's arms tightened protectively around Richard. "Sicilians. The old families." Santo leaned back, one hand rubbing his jaw. "There's a tradition. Ancient. Latte sacro. Sacred milk. When a woman nurses a child who isn't hers, especially the child of a made man, she becomes bound to that family. Protected. Honored. He paused. And trapped. The word trapped sent ice down Linda's spine. I don't want to be part of any tradition. I just wanted to help a dying baby. I know. But wanting doesn't change what is. Santo's voice gentled, almost apologetic. You fed my son. My enemies will learn of this. They always do. And when they learn that Richard has a nutrise, a wet nurse, they will see you as leverage. As a way to hurt me. Linda stared at him. I'm flying back to Chicago in 3 days. You're not. The words were absolute. I'm sorry, Linda. Truly. But the moment you gave Richard your milk, you became mine to protect. And I protect what's mine. The possessiveness in his tone should have terrified her. Instead, something in her recognized the grim necessity behind it. She'd worked in pediatric emergency rooms. She'd seen what people did to the vulnerable when they wanted to send a message. So what? She whispered. I'm your prisoner now? You're my son's savior. There's a difference. Santo reached over, his scarred fingers brushing Richard's downy hair with heartbreaking tenderness. In the old code, a wet nurse is sacra nutrise, sacred and untouchable. Anyone who harms you insults my family's honor. But that protection only works if you stay under my roof, under my guard. Outside of that. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. You're saying I'm safer as your captive than as a free woman. I'm saying you became part of this world the moment you walked up to me on that train. Santo's jaw tightened. My enemies include men who would cut you open just to make me watch. Men who would do worse to Richard. The only way I can guarantee your safety, both of yours, is if you come with me. To my home. Under my protection. The car hummed through Rome's chaotic streets, and Linda felt reality tilting sideways. This morning she'd been a grieving nurse trying to outrun her memories. Now she was tangled in blood debts and ancient codes, holding a mafia heir while his father explained why she couldn't go home. How long? Her voice cracked. Until Richard is weaned. Until my enemies understand you're under the family's protection. Until. Santo stopped, something vulnerable crossing his face. Until he doesn't need you anymore. Linda looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. Richard had her daughter's delicate features, that same translucent skin. Holding him felt like holding a second chance, even if that chance came wrapped in violence and tradition she didn't understand. What if I refuse? She asked, though they both knew she wouldn't. Couldn't. Santo's expression hardened into something that reminded her exactly who he was. Then I keep you anyway. But I'd rather you choose this, Linda. I'd rather you understand why. The Mercedes pulled through iron gates into a private driveway. Ahead, a villa sprawled in Tuscan elegance, beauty built on blood. Linda took a shaky breath. How long to wean him? 10 days. Maybe 2 weeks. Santo's voice dropped. I'll make it worth the sacrifice. But as Linda stepped out of the car into her gilded cage, she wondered if any amount of money could be worth the cost of binding herself to a man whose world devoured anyone foolish enough to show compassion. She'd saved a life today. She just hoped it wouldn't cost her own. The villa emerged from the Tuscan hills like something out of a Renaissance painting, golden stone glowing in the late afternoon sun, cypress trees standing sentinel along the winding drive, terracotta roofs aging gracefully under centuries of weather. It would have been breathtaking if not for the armed men positioned at every corner, the cameras tracking their approach, and the 12-foot walls topped with something that definitely wasn't decorative ironwork. Beauty and violence, Linda thought. Just like the man beside her. The Mercedes stopped in a courtyard where a fountain burbled peacefully, its tranquility completely at odds with the 3 guards who moved to flank them as Santo helped her out. Richard stirred against her shoulder, but didn't wake, his little body finally relaxed after 18 hours of agony. This way. Santo's hand found her lower back again, that same proprietary gentleness that confused her. Prisoner or guest? She couldn't tell anymore. The interior stole her breath. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, original frescoes depicting pastoral scenes that probably cost more than her entire nursing career. Marble floors gleamed under antique chandeliers. A Caravaggio, she was almost certain it was real, hung in the entrance hall with the casual indifference of wealth so old it forgot to show off. "Don't touch anything," a voice cut through Linda's amazement. Sharp. Female. Heavy with Sicilian accent. The woman descending the curved staircase looked like she'd been carved from the same stone as the villa, all hard edges and unyielding lines. Late 50s, silver threaded through black hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing a simple black dress that somehow conveyed more authority than Santo's expensive suit. Her dark eyes swept over Linda with a kind of assessment that saw everything and forgave nothing. "Zia Teresa." Santo's voice held genuine warmth. "This is Linda Marshall. She saved Richard." "So I heard." Teresa reached them, her gaze dropping to the sleeping infant before rising back to Linda. "American." "Yes." Linda straightened, refusing to be intimidated even though every instinct screamed that this woman was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with guns. "From Chicago." "A nurse, my nephew tells me." "Who still had milk?" Teresa's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Not quite softening. More like acknowledging. "You fed him on the train. He was dying." "He was." Teresa stepped closer, studying Linda's face with unnerving intensity. "And now you're here. In my house. Under my roof. Do you understand what you've done, Americana?" Your nephew explained the tradition. Linda's arms tightened around Richard. "I didn't know about it when I—" "Of course you didn't." Teresa's voice held something that might have been respect. "Which makes it worse. Or better. I haven't decided." She reached out suddenly, one weathered finger brushing Richard's cheek with surprising gentleness. "He looks peaceful. First time since Juliana died." The grief that crossed Teresa's face was there and gone in a heartbeat, replaced by steel. "Follow me. I'll show you the nursery." Teresa turned without waiting for agreement, and Linda found herself trailing behind, Santo close at her side. "The room adjoins yours. You'll have privacy but immediate access when he needs feeding. Every 2 hours at first, yes. Probably every 3, given his age." Linda's nurse training kicked in automatically. "But we need to monitor his weight gain. He's dehydrated and underweight. There's a scale in the nursery. Medical supplies. Whatever you need, you ask me." Teresa pushed open a door, revealing a room that made Linda's throat tighten. Soft blue walls. A crib that probably cost more than her car. Shelves lined with books and toys. A rocking chair positioned by windows overlooking olive groves. It was the nursery she'd painted for her daughter. Different colors, different continent, but the same careful love in every detail. Juliana designed it. Santo's voice was rough. Before the delivery. Linda understood the unfinished sentence. Before she died bringing Richard into a world that would try to kill him. Before she left Santo alone with a son he didn't know how to keep alive. "It's beautiful," Linda whispered, because it was, and because the grief in Santo's eyes demanded acknowledgement. Teresa moved through the room with efficient grace, checking windows, testing the baby monitor, her movements those of someone who'd protected this family for decades. "Your room is through here." She opened a connecting door to reveal a bedroom that belonged in a luxury hotel, 4-poster bed, and suite bathroom, its own terrace overlooking the valley. "This is too much." Linda felt overwhelmed, off balance. "I don't need. You're the sacred nutrice now." Teresa's tone left no room for argument. "You'll be treated accordingly. With respect. With honor." She paused, her gaze turning sharp again. "And with supervision. Because respect in this world comes with a price, Americana. And that price is your freedom." Linda wanted to argue, to protest that she wasn't some medieval wet nurse bound by archaic traditions. But Richard chose that moment to wake, his little face scrunching up in preparation for another cry, and her body responded before her mind could catch up, the let-down reflex, the physical need to soothe him. Teresa saw it and nodded, as if Linda had confirmed something. "Feed him. Then rest. Dinner is at 8. She moved toward the door, then paused. "Welcome to the Trevisano family, Linda Marshall. For better or worse, you're one of us now." The door closed behind her with quiet finality. Santo remained, watching as Linda settled into the rocking chair, as Richard latched on with the desperate relief of a child who'd learned hunger too young. Outside the windows, armed guards patrolled between priceless sculptures. Beauty and violence. Safety and captivity. I meant what I said in the car. Santo's voice was soft. I will keep you safe. Linda looked up at him, this man with death in his ink and grief in his eyes, and wondered if safety in his world was just another word for cage. 10 days, she said quietly. You promised 10 days. Santo nodded, but something in his expression suggested he was already counting the cost of letting her go. Richard fed, peaceful and content, while the Tuscan sun painted the hills in gold and blood red. Linda didn't sleep that first night. She lay in the four-poster bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Santo's world, the crunch of gravel as guards changed shifts, the low murmur of Italian spoken into phones somewhere below, the occasional creak of the ancient villa settling into itself. Richard slept soundly in the nursery beside her, the baby monitor casting a soft green glow on the nightstand. For the first time in 18 hours, he was quiet. Federal alive. By morning, Linda had made her decision. She found Santo in the breakfast room, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept either. He sat with a cup of espresso in one hand and a phone in the other, but the phone went down the moment she entered. Those ice-blue eyes tracked her across the room with an attention that felt both protective and predatory. We need to talk. Linda didn't wait for invitation. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, spine straight, chin level. The posture of someone about to negotiate, not surrender. Santo's eyebrow lifted a fraction. Talk. I'm not your prisoner. The words came out firm, practiced from the hours she'd spent rehearsing them in the dark. I'm not your property. I'm not bound by whatever ancient code you believe in. I'm an American citizen, and if I vanish, people will look for me. Will they? Santo's tone carried no threat, just genuine curiosity. The question landed harder than she expected because the honest answer was no. Her ex-husband had stopped calling months ago. Her nursing license was suspended pending a psychiatric evaluation she'd never completed. The only people who might notice her absence were a handful of colleagues who'd send a text, get no response, and eventually stop trying. Santo saw it in her face. He didn't press. Regardless, Linda continued, recovering, I'm staying because Richard needs me. Not because you're keeping me. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it. Santo studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you want? A contract. 10 days. I stay, I feed Richard, I begin weaning him onto a hypoallergenic formula. By day 10, he won't need me anymore and I leave. Freely. With money for a flight and enough cash to start over somewhere. She locked her gaze on his. I also want freedom of movement within the villa. I don't want guards following me room to room. And I want to be treated as a guest, not an asset. Something shifted in Santo's expression, surprise, maybe, or something close to admiration. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest, and for a moment Linda caught a glimpse of the man beneath the mafia boss. Someone who recognized strength when he saw it. 10 days, he repeated. You have my word. Your word isn't enough. His mouth twitched. Almost a smile. What is? Write it down. Sign it. Have your aunt witness it. Linda folded her arms to mirror his posture. If you're serious about honoring old traditions, honor this one too. A promise made should be a promise kept. Santo held her gaze, and something unreadable passed between them. Then he reached for a notepad, actual paper, she noticed, as if the man didn't trust digital, and began writing in neat, precise Italian. Teresa appeared in the doorway as if summoned, read the document over her nephew's shoulder, and signed beneath his name without a word of objection. The old woman's eyes flickered to Linda with something that might have been approval. The ink dried. The contract was done. Linda should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt the fragility of what she'd just built, 10 days of borrowed autonomy inside a world that ate agreements for breakfast. Santo folded the paper and slid it across the table. Your boundaries, Linda. I'll respect them. She took the paper, tucked it into her pocket, and stood to leave. But something stopped her in the doorway. The sound of Richard's cry drifting down from upstairs, not the agonized scream from the train, but a soft, hungry whimper. A normal baby sound. A healthy baby sound. She turned back. How did Juliana die? The question surprised them both. Santo's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin. He stared at his espresso for several heartbeats before answering. Hemorrhage. During the delivery. His voice was stripped of its usual silk, raw and unguarded. The doctors said it was sudden. Unforeseeable. She'd been healthy the entire pregnancy. He paused. Richard was crowning when it happened. She bled out in 4 minutes. The clinical brutality of it hit Linda like cold water. For minutes. She knew hemorrhages. Had seen them in emergency rooms. Had seen the helplessness on doctors' faces when the body simply stopped cooperating. She chose to keep pushing, Santo added quietly. The doctors told her to stop. Told her they could get Richard out surgically, that she should wait. But she looked at them and said. His voice cracked, barely perceptible, but Linda caught it. She said, "My son is not waiting 1 more minute." The silence that followed was heavy with everything that birth and death shared in common. She saved him, Linda whispered. Santo met her eyes, and for the first time, the walls behind his fell completely away. What she saw underneath was not a mafia boss. It was a man hollowed out by guilt, by grief, by the slow realization that his wife had traded her life for their son's, and that he had been powerless to stop it. "Yes," he said. "She saved him. And now you are." A beat. "I'm not going to let that mean nothing, Linda." Richard whimpered again from upstairs, and Linda went to him without another word. But something had cracked open between them in that quiet breakfast room, something neither of them had permission to feel. 10 days. She just had to survive 10 days. Santo watched her go, the signed contract still warm from her hands, and wondered if he was already counting wrong. It started on the 3rd night. Linda had just finished the 2 o'clock feeding when she carried Richard back to his crib and found Santo already there, standing in the dark with his sleeves rolled up, watching his son with an expression so unguarded it felt like trespassing. He didn't startle when she entered. Didn't pretend he hadn't been watching. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly, settling Richard into the crib with the practiced ease that was becoming second nature. "Never could." Santo leaned against the windowsill, the moonlight catching the edges of his tattoos. "Not since she died." They stayed like that for a while, 2 strangers who weren't strangers anymore, listening to Richard breathe. And then Santo started talking. It came out in fragments, the way grief always does. Not in order, not in sentences that flowed cleanly from one to the next, but in pieces dropped like stones into still water. He told her about Juliana, not the woman who'd hemorrhaged on an operating table, but the woman before that. The girl from a rival family his father had chosen for him when Santo was 19, a political marriage designed to consolidate territory. He'd expected to feel nothing. Instead, he'd fallen in love with her in a way that terrified him, because love in his world was a target painted on your back. "I brought her into this life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't choose it. Her family chose it for her. And I let it happen because it benefited me." He paused. "I told myself she was safe. That I would protect her from everything. But I couldn't protect her from her own body." The guilt in his voice was a living thing, breathing in the dark between them. Linda didn't offer comfort. Didn't say the things people always said, that it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known. She understood that those words were hollow placeholders, and Santo didn't need placeholders. He needed someone who understood what it felt like to carry a death that wasn't your fault, but somehow was. So on the 4th night, when Santo showed up in the nursery again at 2 in the morning, Linda told him about Emily. She didn't plan to. The name came out of her like something that had been locked behind her ribs for 4 months, pressing against bone, desperate for air. Emily. The daughter who'd never drawn breath. The nursery painted in pale yellow. The silence in the delivery room that no one seemed willing to break first. "Stillbirth," Linda said, and the word tasted like ash. 38 weeks. Everything had been perfect. Every scan, every appointment. She stared at Richard sleeping between them, this impossible baby who was thriving under her care, gaining an ounce a day. And then nothing. Just nothing. Santo didn't look away. Didn't flinch. My husband blamed me. The confession fell out before she could stop it. Not out loud. He never said it directly. But he stopped touching me. Stopped looking at me the way he used to. Started sleeping in the guest room. And I couldn't blame him because I was blaming myself. You shouldn't. Neither should you. She met his eyes in the dark. And here we are. Something passed between them, recognition, maybe. The shared understanding of two people who'd been carrying unbearable weight alone and had finally found someone who knew exactly how heavy it was. I came to Italy to disappear, Linda continued, her voice steadier now, emptied of the poison she'd been carrying. I packed one suitcase. Didn't tell anyone. Booked a one-way ticket and told myself I'd figure out the rest when I got here. She laughed, a hollow, broken sound. And then I ended up on a train with a crying baby and a mafia boss. Santo's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close. The closest she'd seen from him. The universe has a vicious sense of humor, he said. Or a cruel one. There's a difference? Richard stirred between them, making a small sound, not a cry, but something softer. A content murmur. Both their heads turned toward him simultaneously, and Linda watched as Richard's face scrunched, yawned, and then did something that stopped her heart. He smiled. It was barely there, a fleeting twitch of his tiny mouth, eyes still closed, body relaxing back into sleep. But it was unmistakable. A real smile. The first one. Santo's breath caught. He reached into the crib, one finger grazing his son's cheek with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. His eyes glistened in the moonlight, and Linda looked away to give him the privacy of his emotion. He's thriving, she said softly. Gaining weight. His color is better. Whatever was causing the colic, it's resolving. Santo didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. You gave him that. You. I'm a nurse. It's what I don't. Santo turned to face her, and the raw honesty in his expression pinned her in place. Don't hide behind that. Not here. Not at 2 a.m. when we're both telling each other things we've never said out loud. Linda held his gaze. The air between them felt charged, electric, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with guns or blood oaths. You're right, she whispered. They stood there in the nursery, separated by a crib and everything they hadn't yet allowed themselves to feel, while Richard slept on, peaceful, fed, alive, proof that two broken people could still create something whole. Outside, the Tuscan night stretched endless and silent, and for the first time since arriving, Linda felt less like a prisoner and more like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Santo disappeared on the 5th morning. Not physically, Linda could hear him somewhere in the villa, his voice low and urgent behind closed doors, phone calls bleeding into phone calls. But the man who'd stood beside her in the nursery at 2 a.m, whose finger had trembled brushing his son's cheek, was gone. In his place was someone colder. Harder. Someone whose jaw sat at angles that reminded her he hadn't built an empire with charm alone. Teresa noticed Linda noticing. The old woman appeared in the kitchen doorway while Linda ate breakfast with Richard propped against her chest in a worn cotton sling and said nothing for a long moment. Just watched. Something's happened, Linda said. It wasn't a question. Teresa poured herself espresso, black and bitter. Enzo Caruso knows about you. The name meant nothing to Linda. But the way Teresa said it, the way the air in the room seemed to thicken around the syllables, told her everything she needed to know. He's from Palermo, Teresa continued, settling into the chair across from Linda with the careful movements of someone choosing each word before releasing it. His family and ours have been at war for 60 years. His father killed Santo's grandfather. Santo's father killed 2 of Enzo's brothers. The blood between us is old. Deep. She sipped her espresso. Enzo has been waiting years for an opportunity to end the Trevisano line. Richard is that opportunity. You are the key to reaching him. Linda's arms tightened around the baby without conscious thought. What does that mean? Practically, it means Enzo will come for you. For both of you. Teresa's dark eyes were steady, unflinching. Not quickly. He's patient. But he will come. The morning light that had been warming Linda's face suddenly felt insufficient. She glanced toward the window where, beyond the manicured gardens, armed men moved between cypress trees with new urgency. More of them than yesterday. She counted 6 where there had been 3. Santo found her an hour later in the nursery, Richard sleeping after his mid-morning feed. He filled the doorway, phone still in his hand, and Linda could see the war happening behind his eyes, the boss calculating, the man afraid. "I have a way out for you." His voice was careful, measured. "A new passport. A flight to Lisbon under a false name. You'd have enough money to disappear properly. Start over somewhere Enzo would never think to look." The offer hung between them. Clean. Logical. The right move. Linda looked at Richard, his round cheeks, the healthy flush that hadn't been there 5 days ago, the tiny fist curled against the mattress in peaceful sleep. She thought about the nursery in Chicago, still painted yellow. About the silence of her empty apartment. About how, for the first time in 4 months, she'd woken that morning without the first thought being a dead baby's name. "No." Santo blinked. "Linda. He needs me for at least another 5 days. The weaning protocol isn't complete." She held his gaze, steady and sure. "And I'm not running." Something flickered across Santo's face, relief he was trying hard to hide. "It's dangerous." "I know." Linda turned back to Richard, adjusting his blanket with hands that didn't shake. "But so was walking up to you on that train. I stopped running from things that scared me 5 days ago." Santo was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, "Teresa will increase the security." "I figured." He lingered in the doorway another moment, as if there were more words he wanted to say, but the language for them hadn't been invented yet. Then he was gone, and Linda was alone with the sleeping baby and the weight of a choice that had nothing to do with Richard's feeding schedule and everything to do with the fact that somewhere, for the first time since Chicago, she had chosen to stay. Outside, the guards multiplied. Somewhere in Palermo, a man named Enzo Caruso was planning something terrible. And Linda sat in a nursery in the Tuscan hills, holding a baby who wasn't hers, and felt less afraid than she had in months. The afternoon stole up on them quietly. Richard had gone down early, his naps stretching longer each day as his body caught up on weeks of lost sleep, and Linda found herself drifting outside instead of retreating to her room. The garden behind the villa was another contradiction of Santo's world, wild jasmine climbing ancient stone walls, olive trees gnarled and silver in the afternoon light, a stone bench worn smooth by generations of hands. Beautiful. Peaceful. Ringed by a wall thick enough to stop a war. Santo was already there. He sat on the bench with his jacket off, sleeves pushed up, a glass of something amber catching the sun. The tattoos on his neck caught the light too, dark ink against skin that had warmed in the Tuscan heat. He looked, for once, like someone who wasn't carrying the weight of the world. He looked like a man simply sitting in a garden, and Linda stopped walking because the sight of it knocked something loose in her chest. Eavesdropping. His mouth curved without looking up. Admiring the view. The words left her before she could edit them, and the air between them shifted, charged, sudden, inevitable. Santo looked at her then. Really looked. Not the assessing stare of a man calculating threats or the careful gaze of a father watching the woman who saved his son. Something rawer. Hungrier. Something he'd been holding at bay for days and was running out of strength to contain. Linda sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The bench was old, worn narrow by time, and the space between them was nothing at all. They talked. About small things at first, the olive harvest, the way the light turned gold this time of day, the ridiculous fact that Richard had sneezed 5 times in a row that morning and Santo had genuinely panicked. Then the conversation thinned, the way it does when 2 people run out of words that aren't the ones they actually want to say. Santo set down his glass, turned toward her. His hand came up, not fast, not demanding, but with a hesitation that broke something open in Linda's chest. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, light as a question. "Linda, don't say you shouldn't." Her voice came out rough. "I already know. I was going to say I don't care." He kissed her among the olive trees, and it was nothing like Linda expected from a man like Santo. There was no force in it. No possession. Just warmth and patience, and the slow, devastating tenderness of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be gentle and was relearning it because of her. When they pulled apart, Linda's eyes burned. Santo's thumb caught a tear she hadn't realized had fallen, brushing it away with the same hand that had once signed orders for men to disappear. "I'm falling in love with him," she whispered, and they both knew she meant Richard. And then, quieter, "And you?" Santo exhaled a long, unsteady breath, like a man surfacing after being held underwater. "I haven't felt peace in 3 years." His forehead dropped to hers. "Not once. Not until you walked into that nursery and made my son smile." They stayed like that until the sun dipped low and the guards changed shift and the world outside the garden walls began its nightly rotation of vigilance. Santo walked her back inside with his hand finding hers, their fingers threading together like it was the most natural thing in the world. Linda was halfway up the stairs when Teresa appeared at the bottom, a glass of wine in one hand, her expression carved from stone. A word, Americana. Linda descended back down slowly, something cold settling in her stomach. Teresa led her to the study, a room Linda hadn't entered before, dark wood and leather, and the faint smell of old cigars. The old woman closed the door and turned, and for the first time since Linda had known her, Teresa looked not angry or suspicious, but genuinely afraid. "What you feel for my nephew?" Teresa's voice was stripped of its usual sharpness. Raw. Almost pleading. "Whatever it is, it will kill you. Teresa, listen to me." The old woman stepped closer, gripping Linda's arm with fingers that trembled. "I have watched this family destroy everyone it touches. Juliana, Santo's mother, his father's first wife. Every woman who loved a Trevisano man ended up in the ground." Her dark eyes searched Linda's face with desperate intensity. "Enzo is already watching. He knows Santo is vulnerable now. He knows why. And when enemies in this world want to break a man, they don't come for him." Teresa's grip tightened. "They come for what he loves most." The study was very quiet. Linda could hear the clock on the mantel. Could hear, distantly, Richard stirring in his nursery upstairs, that soft, trusting murmur of a baby who didn't know the world was sharpening its teeth around him. "Be careful, child," Teresa whispered, releasing her arm. "Be very careful what you let yourself become in this house." Linda climbed the stairs back to the nursery with the taste of Santo's kiss still on her lips and Teresa's warning settling into her bones like winter. Linda woke to darkness. Not the soft, natural dark of a Tuscan night, but an absolute void, the kind that meant something had been switched off. The bedside lamp. The baby monitor's green glow. The subtle hum of the villa's security system that she'd grown so accustomed to she'd stopped hearing it. All of it gone. She sat up, heart already hammering, and in the same breath heard Teresa's footsteps, fast, purposeful, nothing like the old woman's usual measured stride. The bedroom door flew open and Teresa was there, a candle in one hand, her face stripped of every pretense of composure. "Get up. Take the baby. Now." Linda didn't ask questions. She was already moving, already lifting Richard from his crib in the dark, already pressing him against her chest with the fierce, protective instinct that had become as natural as breathing over the past 8 days. Richard whimpered at the sudden waking, but didn't cry. As if even he understood that crying was not allowed tonight. Teresa grabbed Linda's wrist and pulled her into the corridor. The villa was deathly silent, no guards calling out, no radios crackling. The silence was worse than noise. It meant something had already happened to the people whose job was to make noise when it mattered. "Where's Santo?" Linda whispered as Teresa dragged her down a narrow servants' passage Linda had never seen. "Out. A meeting in Siena." Teresa's voice was clipped, controlled, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this scenario in her mind 100 times and prayed she'd never need it. "The safe room is below the cellar. Stone walls. Soundproofed. Once we're inside." The first gunshot split the air like a bone breaking. Linda flinched so violently her legs nearly buckled. Richard screamed, a raw, terrified sound that tore through the darkness. Teresa's grip on her wrist turned vicious, yanking her forward. Don't stop. Another shot. Closer. Then shouting in Italian, rough and unfamiliar. Linda's blood turned to ice as Teresa shouldered open a heavy oak door, revealing stone steps descending into blackness. The old woman shoved Linda through first, and for a moment, just a sliver of a moment, Linda thought they'd made it. Then the guard stepped out from behind the cellar door. He was one of Santo's men. She recognized his face from the garden rotations, had nodded to him that morning over breakfast. But his eyes were wrong now. Flat. Transactional. He spoke one sentence in Italian to Teresa, and the old woman's face crumbled. Traditor, Teresa breathed. Traitor. Two of Enzo's men materialized behind him, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. One pulled Teresa back with an arm locked around her throat. The other reached for Richard. Linda turned her body, shielding the baby with everything she had. Don't touch him. The man didn't hesitate. He didn't need to. A third hand closed around Linda's arm and twisted, and the pain was sharp enough to white out her vision for a second. She held Richard tighter. Wouldn't let go. Couldn't let go. They dragged her up through the villa's back entrance, and Linda caught one last glimpse of the house as they pulled her through, the Caravaggio crooked on its wall, a shattered vase on the marble floor, Teresa's candle still burning in the servants' passage, flickering. The night air hit her face. A van waited at the edge of the property, engine running, headlights off. Linda climbed in because there was no other option, Richard screaming against her chest, and as the doors slammed shut, she heard the crunch of gravel as Santo's car pulled through the front gates. She didn't see his face. Didn't see the moment he stepped out and took in the broken front door, the silence where guards should have been, the blood on the hallway floor. Didn't see him reach for his phone and find it dead. Didn't see him walk through the villa calling her name, Linda, once, twice, and hear nothing back but the echo of his own voice in a house that had become a tomb. But she knew. Somehow, in the way that grief and terror make you attuned to the people you love, she knew he was there. Standing in the dark, in the wreckage of everything he'd built, and realizing that the only thing that ever mattered was already gone. The van disappeared into the Tuscan night, and the villa behind it went dark. The monastery had been dead for 2 centuries, but it still smelled like prayer. Linda sat on the cold stone floor of what had once been a chapel, Richard cradled against her chest, and watched Enzo Caruso set up the camera. He was smaller than she'd imagined, compact, silver-haired, with the unremarkable face of a man who could sit in any cafe in Sicily without drawing a second glance. It was the eyes that gave him away. Patient. Reptilian. Eyes that had waited 60 years for this exact moment. Santo will come, Enzo said, not looking at her. His Italian was soft, almost musical. He always does. For what he loves. Linda said nothing. She was counting. The wine had been her idea, offered to Enzo's men an hour ago with a trembling smile and the excuse that her nerves were shattered, that she needed something to take the edge off, that surely they could spare a glass for the woman and her baby. They'd laughed. Poured generously. Toasted each other's health with the casual cruelty of men who enjoyed having the upper hand. Linda was a pediatric nurse. She knew dosages the way other people knew prayers. The sedative she'd crushed from her own prescription, the one she'd carried since Chicago, the one she'd been taking in small doses to sleep through the grief, had dissolved into the wine without a trace of bitterness. 40 minutes had passed. Enzo's 4 men were slumped against the monastery walls, breathing slow and deep, their guns slack in their laps. Enzo himself had declined the wine. Of course he had. Men like him never drank what strangers poured. But he was alone now. The camera blinked red. Live feed. Santo's face filled the small screen mounted beside it, drawn, hollowed, his ice blue eyes burning with something that went beyond fury into a place Linda had no name for. He was already here. Already coming. Enzo smiled and adjusted the camera toward Linda and Richard. Let him see what he's fighting for. Santo appeared in the monastery doorway 3 minutes later, and Linda's heart cracked at the sight of him. No jacket. No guards. Unarmed, as demanded. He walked toward Enzo with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking toward his own grave, and he knelt. Santo Trevisano, the most feared don in the Sicilian underworld, knelt on the cold stone floor of a dead chapel and bowed his head. "It's done," he said. "Let them go." Enzo's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, and Linda whistled. It was a sharp, low sound, absurd in the sacred silence of the place. But it was the signal. The one she'd agreed to with Santo's man Marco, Teresa's nephew, the one guard who'd survived the villa, who'd found Linda in the van before it left the property and slipped a phone into her hand with one word: "Signal us." The monastery doors exploded inward. Santo moved before the dust settled, not toward Enzo but toward Linda, his body covering hers and Richard's as the world erupted into the kind of controlled violence that men like him were built for. It was over in seconds. Enzo tried to draw. Didn't finish the motion. Santo's men were faster, and the pistol clattered to the ancient floor, and Enzo Caruso, patient, reptilian Enzo, found himself on his knees for the first time in his life. Santo didn't look at him. Didn't need to. He was already on his knees beside Linda, his hands shaking as he touched her face, touched Richard, making sure they were whole. "You're all right," he breathed. Not a question. A prayer. "I'm all right." Linda pressed her forehead to his. "We're all right." The concilium convened 3 days later in a building that didn't exist on any map. Santo walked in alone and walked out an hour later with his empire in pieces, and his name erased from every territory, every business, every ledger that had defined his family for 3 generations. Mort Bianca. The White Death. The 5 families had never granted it before. Santo Trevisano was the first man in living memory to trade everything, power, legacy, blood, for the right to simply disappear. They granted it not because they were generous, but because they were afraid. A man willing to kneel unarmed before his enemy and surrender his life for a woman and a baby was a man they no longer understood. And men like that were more dangerous than any don. Better to let him go. Linda was waiting on the steps outside when he emerged, Richard on her hip, the autumn sun catching the dark waves of her hair. Santo stopped in front of her and stood very still, as if memorizing the way she looked in that exact light. "It's done," he said. "I know. I have nothing left to offer you. No money. No protection. No name that means anything anymore." Linda shifted Richard to her other hip and reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw the way he had done to her in the garden among the olive trees. "Santo." "Yes. Take me home." They married in a courthouse in Athens 6 weeks later, no ceremony, no tradition, no ancient code demanding anything of either of them. Just 2 people choosing each other in the most ordinary way the world allows. A year later, on a morning so bright it hurt to look at, Santo Trevisano, no longer a don, no longer anyone's fear, stood waist-deep in the Aegean Sea with his son in his arms. Richard was 1 year old, laughing at the waves, his small hands slapping the water with the reckless joy of a child who had no idea how close he'd come to never feeling the sun on his face. Linda watched from the shore, her bare feet in the sand, a cup of coffee warm in her hands. The nursery in Chicago was gone, sold, emptied, grieved over. Emily lived in a different kind of place now, one that didn't require yellow paint or tiny clothes. Santo caught her eye across the water and smiled. Not the guarded half-smile of a man protecting secrets, but something open and unguarded and entirely new. The most dangerous thing he did these days was teach his son to swim. And the sea held them both, easy and endless, like it had all the time in the world.